listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96 with Melinda Francis, Norman Richmond, Lisa Watson on the buttons, and on the line is Dr. Gerald Horne, author of the great book, Jazz and Justice, Racism and the Political Economy of the Music, and he's also written about dozens of other books. And the reason I mentioned the jazz book is because today, in 1972, on this day, February 19th, Lee Morgan was slain. I think it was at Slugs. It was in New York or New Jersey. I think it was in New York. I just wanted to get your comments on Lee Morgan.
Yeah, it was on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, certainly New York City. And on Freedom Now KPFK, Los Angeles, 11 a.m. Pacific, we oftentimes feature the music of Lee Morgan. As a matter of fact, we did as recently as last week. And raising that point also allows me to mention the Pan-African Film Festival, which will end tomorrow in Los Angeles. And as ever, they had a number of useful music documentaries. Last night, I saw the one on Little Richard Penniman of Macon, Georgia, the self-proclaimed founder of the music we now call rock music or rock and roll, according to Little Richard. I recommend it. It was very well funded through CNN and HBO Max, so it'll probably get wide distribution. And they had a number of talking heads who were talking about Little Richard, understandably, from the perspective of queer studies. Since Little Richard, he obviously had a life as a gay man, but he also had a life as a heterosexually married man as well, and was an influence, as he would put it, on James Brown, Rolling Stones, the Beatles, etc. And I also saw a documentary about Roy Hargrove, the trumpeter who passed away at the age of 49 just a few years ago, roots in Texas. It was done by a longtime friend of his, and so it was not as well funded as the Little Richard documentary, but it was similarly insightful. I'm not sure what kind of distribution it will get. It's entitled Hargrove, but you mentioned my Jazz and Justice book, and the Roy Hargrove documentary really reinforces many of the themes of that book in terms of his exploitation, not least by his own management. I mean, that's what oftentimes happens, I'm afraid to say, to these musicians. There's an enemy within the gates. It's bad enough to be exploited by club owners and record labels. But when your own management is exploiting you, you know that you have an uphill climb. And I also saw a documentary on the music of Kansas City. We all know about how Count Basie and Mary Lou Williams earned fame and fortune in Kansas City, Missouri, for the most part, and how Charlie Parker had roots in Kansas City, Kansas, right across the river. But they also touch on Bobby Watson, who played with Art Blakey. They talk about Janelle Monáe, who they don't get an interview with her, which was very interesting, but she apparently had roots in KCK, Kansas City, Kansas. So the documentary is called Kansas City Dreaming. Once again, I'm not sure if it'll get wide distribution, but it's certainly worth a peek.
So could I ask you this, Dr. Horne? You did a panel with Ayuko, Babu, and Charles Burnett. Could you talk about how was that received?
Well, you mean for this film festival? I interviewed Charles Burnett for Freedom Now last week. It was a good interview. You all should check it out. We interviewed him and Ayuko Babu on the same program. I guess it was about a week ago. It's just as the film festival was opening. And both, of course, have close ties to Los Angeles. Burnett has roots in Mississippi, but grew up in South Los Angeles. And he did To Sleep with Anger with Danny Glover. He did a film over in Namibia on the liberation struggle. He did a film on Nat Turner and the slave revolt. He worked on a film on Geronimo Pratt, the Black Panthers, that never got produced. So we do a survey of his enormously illustrative career. And during the same program on Freedom Now, 11 a.m. Pacific on Saturdays on kpfk.org, we interviewed Babu, the executive director of the Pan-African Film Festival, which is in its 31st year.
Well, let me say that Charles Burnett was a great high hurdler. We went to the same high school, and he was a city champion, maybe 2 or 3 years in a row. He ran the high hurdles, and Ayuko Babu was pretty good. He got a scholarship playing basketball. So yeah, those two are very, very interesting individuals.
Yeah, check out the interviews.
Yeah. Go ahead, Melinda.
Yeah, I'm just directing. So we kind of missed this last week. Do we want to talk about, white supremacy at the Oscars?
Oh, yes. So what happened is that the Oscars, which is given out by this LA-based entity, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, it's an annual event. And interestingly enough, the stars of The Woman King, Viola Davis, and the star of Till, about the slaying of young teenager Emmett Till, were expected to be nominated, but were not. And some Euro-American woman who was in a movie that grossed about $30,000. I mean, which is something, because part of the criteria for the Academy is supposedly your movie has to make it at the box office. And Woman King with Viola Davis made $100 million at the box office. I'm not sure if that's US or worldwide. And it's a film, as you know, that deals with this brigade of women warriors at the beginning of the 19th century in West Africa. And so what happened is that this woman, this Euro-American woman who gets the Oscar nomination for Best Actor, as I note, her film didn't make that much money, but she had a number of folks behind her, including the actors Ed Norton and Susan Sarandon and Gwyneth Paltrow, etc. And so she got nominated. What's interesting is that usually when you get nominated, your film does even better. And so it was perceived as quite a blow to Viola Davis in particular. And once again, in case people didn't recognize it or understand it, another affirmation of white supremacy in Hollywood.
You're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. You have something to say, Melinda?
Yeah, I just had to just addendum to that is, do you think it was it was pretty much financed outside of, the Hollywood kind of, thing. It was like, I saw that it was financed by governments of Benin, South Africa, and Ireland, which was interesting to me. Do you think that was King, right? Because the Woman King, that it was, basically they had to go outside of the U.S. to even get financing to get it made?
Well, as you know, that's not unusual. I was just talking to a friend, Billy Woodbury, another formerly LA-based filmmaker. He's doing a movie now on documentary on Mario Andrade, who is a leader of the liberation struggle in Angola. And I was mentioning to him the movie, let me recommend this movie. If people haven't seen it, you really owe it to yourself. And I say that particularly to our friends north of the border. I'm talking of The Book of Negroes, which was financed by Canadian Broadcasting, South African Broadcasting, and BET of the United States, Black Entertainment Television. And it's really worth seeing. And like The Woman King, they had to go outside of Hollywood in order to get it financed. It's a multi-part series on slavery in North America in the late 18th century. A scene where the heroine, who plays the lead role in King Richard with Will Smith. You can refresh my recollection as to her name. She confronts George Washington about slavery in this movie. It's quite moving, quite remarkable. I recommend it highly, The Book of Negroes.
We had Lawrence Hill's younger brother on a couple of weeks ago, Dan Hill Jr. He is the brother. Sometimes when we touch of someone, sometimes when we touch fame, that's Lawrence's older brother.
Oh, okay, fair enough.
And could we talk about this Ukraine situation? That seems to be, there's some people that say that we should talk more about Ukraine, and there are some people that say we should forget about the Ukraine. I know that's not your position, but what is the situation with the Ukraine as we speak in 2023?
Well, I mean, speak about it less. I think that's ridiculous because, quite frankly, this small planet is sleepwalking towards World War III, which could mean the extinction of humanity. So I guess people say talk less about Ukraine. I guess they're not even concerned about their own welfare. But we're marching also towards the first anniversary of the so-called special military operation inaugurated in February 24th, 2022, with Russian forces moving into Ukraine. And as we speak, we see the concluding of the Munich Security Conference. Your Canadian leaders, I assume, were there, including Chrystia Freeland, the equivalent of a foreign minister. But what's remarkable about this Munich Security Conference, where Russia was not invited, Iran was not invited, but the opposition in both countries were extended invitations, is that one of the reasons why we're sleepwalking towards World War III is that it's not going very well, despite the rhetoric and propaganda to the contrary. What I mean is there are all of these reports coming out of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization countries that the Ukrainians are running out of bullets. And what's interesting is that the Russians are not, and this is partly a legacy of the Soviet experience, because during the Soviet period, obviously, there was always this fear of invasion, which took place, as you know, in June 1942 with the Germans. And so they were keen to build a state-owned, state-directed munitions industry, which is now running 24/7. And so there does not seem to be any danger of the Russians running out of munitions because of that Soviet background, not to mention the fact that even before the Soviet Union, Russia was repeatedly invaded by the Swedes, by Napoleon, etc. And so what's happening at this Munich Security Conference is that President Macron spoke of France, obviously, and it was a very contradictory speech because on the one hand, he reaffirmed that he's on Team NATO, even though some months ago he said NATO was brain dead. But his speech reflected recriminations because he knows that this escapade is not going very well. Yet on the one hand, he's quick to affirm that he's willing to go down with the ship. But it seems, I guess for historical purposes, he's pointing out that this was a harebrained idea in the first instance, that there's not going to be regime change in Moscow as had been envisioned, and that the defeat of NATO in Ukraine will mark a major shift in the global correlation of forces. And so, this, as I said, the remarks by Mr. Macron were quite contradictory. Then the backdrop of this Munich Security Conference is that Seymour Hersh, the prize-winning 85-year-old journalist of the United States, published this blockbuster article. Recall a few months ago, the pipeline connecting Russian natural gas fields to Germany was blown up. And the $64 question is, who did it? Seymour Hersh says it was the United States and Norway. Norway stands to benefit by replacing Russia as a supplier of energy. The head of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is Stoltenberg, who has Norwegian ties. What's interesting is that this article has been ignored by the US press, New York Times, Washington Post, Bloomberg, etc. It's getting a lot of play in Germany because Germany was a victim of this escapade. And this has caused a lot of consternation in certain circles on the left in the United States, amongst, I have to say in all fairness, or including myself, who have called for an investigation as to the United States' role in this act of aggression against an ally, so-called, speaking of Germany, also reinforcing the idea that Germany is not wholly sovereign and independent, which you can say, quite frankly, for a number of so-called NATO allies, that they basically dance to the tune that's played by Uncle Sam, which then leads us to Vice President Kamala Harris, who's at Munich, and she called for the Russian leadership to be subjected to war crimes tribunals. Now, this is a very dangerous door to open, because if anybody needs to be subjected to war crimes tribunals, it's the leaders of the United States of America, given their depredations in Iraq, Afghanistan, and sites too numerous to mention. And so I would caution Washington to be very careful about this idea of putting leaders on trial for war crimes. Recall that George W. Bush, the former US president, has been forced to alter his travel itineraries to certain countries for fear of being detained. Recall, that's what happened to the late Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet, who had the lack of good sense to travel to London without necessarily clearing it with his lawyers, and was detained there for months because of a warrant for his detention by a Spanish magistrate. He was able to escape being extradited to Spain because he said he was in bad health. Then when he lands at the airport in Santiago de Chile in a wheelchair, he does everything except get out of the wheelchair and breakdance. So obviously that was fallacious. So in any case, Norman, please brief me. Who is saying that we do not need to talk about Ukraine in light of what I've just said?
I don't think that they even deserve even mentioning. These are basically some of our own lunatic fringe of the skin nationalist element, you know. And they are, I think they're phasing out. I mean, because I think the majority of everyday people, whether they be African, Asian, Latin American, European, realizes. I don't think the average person. It's not in the benefit of any human beings to go to have any kind of nuclear war. Anybody that's sane, you know what I mean. I guess you have some people that are insane that don't care about it, or maybe some white supremacists that think that if they can control it, that if I can't have you, no one can have you type of situation. But I think that's a lunatic fringe that's saying that. So I don't even know if it's even worth talking about, but mentioning them. But it is. I mean, it's crazy what they're saying.
I see. Well, moving on, Melinda.
Do we want to go to Mali and Guinea and the Burkina Confederate?
Yeah, what's happening is that Mali, Guinea, Conakry, and Burkina Faso are confederating. That is to say, they're going to be under a similar political umbrella. It's not as if they're giving up their sovereignty and independence, but they are tightening their links. And they're doing this in the face of pressure from France. Just to digress on France for a moment, I mentioned Mr. Macron and his contradictory remarks at the Munich Security Conference, and it reflects, as I was seeking to intimate, that France is stuck because, on the one hand, to maintain its neo-empire in Africa, which included Mali, Burkina Faso, and Guinea Conakry, it has to rely upon U.S. imperialism, the Africa Command of the Pentagon. But at the same time, it does not want to rely upon U.S. imperialism, but it doesn't have a choice. And so you see that with the attempt to break away from the French apron strings by these three West African nations, you see why France feels the obligation to rely upon U.S. imperialism. I should also say that this attempted confederation has implications for West African politics. Recall ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, where Nigeria, giant of the continent, population 200 million plus, a population mostly under 30, a country that will be one of the 3 or 4 most populous nations on planet Earth within decades, perhaps number 3 behind China and India. Nigeria is the powerhouse of ECOWAS, but with this attempted unity of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Guinea Conakry, you see that there's going to be a counterweight to Nigeria, which, by the way, will have elections within a few days. And I guess we'll probably talk about those elections a week from today, because it has enormous implications for Pan-African politics. And speaking of Pan-African politics, there have been bitter experiences with all of these 3 aforementioned countries with world imperialism. Recall Sekou Touré of Guinea Conakry and the problems he had leading his country to independence, breaking ties with France. France retaliates by seeking to destabilize Guinea Conakry. As they're leaving, they try to take light bulbs, typewriters, toilets, leaving the country flat on its back. Recall that Mali under Modibo Keita, who dies mysteriously with French intelligence being suspected, or not to mention Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso, was killed in the 1980s, apparently by his comrade, Blaise Compaoré, but certainly France was suspected. And so I should also mention that Black Americans' role has been contradictory in this part of Africa. Recall that when Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, also of West Africa, was overthrown in 1966, that the U.S. ambassador, Franklin Williams, was tied to the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. This was part of this entente, this bargain between the Black leadership and U.S. imperialism, where some would get plums, like being an ambassador in return for going along with imperialism. Now that bargain is expiring. But in any case, Franklin Williams was suspected of having a principal role in the overthrow of Nkrumah, who then moves to Guinea Conakry, you recall, and spends his declining years there. But also moving to Guinea Conakry at the same time was the Black American intellectual W. Alpheus Hunton, a former Howard University professor, who, by the way, is featured in my book, which will be out in a few weeks, Revolting Capital, Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000. Alpheus Hunton, of course, was a comrade of Robeson and Du Bois, had moved to Ghana to work on the Encyclopedia Africana, but was driven into exile when Nkrumah was overthrown. So, as I told an audience last week, let us hope that going forward in the future, that we will try to walk in the footsteps of Alpheus Hunton rather than Franklin Williams.
Excuse me, Dr. Horne. Alpheus Hunting, doesn't he have some ties to Canada?
Oh yeah, his family is a long-term Black Canadian family, going back to those who escaped from enslavement in the 19th century, pre-U.S. Civil War, 1861. Apparently, when the late, great John Brown comes to Canada to plot the attempt to overthrow slavery by military means at Harper's Ferry in what is now West Virginia in the fall of 1859, that the ancestors of Hunting were present and in on the plot. So he has quite a significant pedigree.
Well, Walter Anthony Rodney mentions Alpheus Hunting in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. He speaks briefly, but he talks glowingly about. I think a lot of people. I guess you're helping a lot of people realize that he made a major contribution to the struggle of Africans on the continent as well as in the diaspora.
Clearly so.
Could we talk about Mexico and Cuba?
Yeah, so there was a very important meeting of the Cuban and Mexican leadership in the past week. Very important, where Mexico pledged to lead a worldwide campaign against the U.S.-sponsored blockade against Cuba. This is very significant. President López Obrador is burnishing his reputation by making this pledge. I should also mention that the relationship between Mexico and Cuba is long-standing. Recall that when Fidel Castro Ruz and his brother Raúl and Che Guevara of Argentina were plotting to overthrow the U.S.-backed Batista regime in Havana, that a good deal of the plotting took place in Mexico, just like John Brown was plotting against the United States from Canada. And we also know that in the 19th century, that when Mexico had a leader of African descent, speaking of Vicente Guerrero in the 1820s, 200 years before Barack Obama, by the way, that he was also campaigning against slavery in Cuba. And in fact, was campaigning against slavery in the then Mexican province that was Texas or Tejas. That latter campaign infuriated the Anglo settlers in Tejas, Texas, led by Sam Houston and Stephen F. Austin, ostentatiously bequeathed their names to two leading cities in what is now the United States, and that led to his, not only his overthrow, but his being executed. So this relationship between Mexico and Cuba is longstanding, and I salute our friends and comrades in Mexico City who have decided to take on this very important campaign.
You're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. I heard you on Greg Carr's podcast, and you mentioned the fact that you are writing a book about the Los Angeles Panthers, but it looked like you've expanded it to talk about other things that took place in Los Angeles.
That's true. The book right now is titled Armed Struggle, ? Panthers, Communists, and Black Nationalism in Los Angeles through the 1960s. So I'm dealing with not only the Panthers and the precursors to the Panthers, which would be the Black communists of the pre-1960s era. I'm dealing with the concept of armed struggle because the Panthers quite famously decided to pick up the gun. I'm not sure if they were well prepared in doing so. So for future generations, I'm going to do a survey of guerrilla warfare and military science for those who might be so bold as to pick up the gun in the 21st century. And obviously, I'm dealing with the radicalism that helped to give birth to the Panther Party, the Civil Rights Congress under the leadership of William L. Patterson, who, as you know, was a Black man born in San Francisco circa 1890, had a strong chapter in Oakland, which was the birthplace of the Black Panther Party. So this book, I'm in LA as we speak, and I'm actually headed up north to do research at the Huey Newton papers at Stanford, some of the papers of Angela Davis's lawyers at UC Santa Cruz, papers of Eldridge Cleaver at Berkeley, the records of the penitentiary in Sacramento, the records of Harry Hay, who's reputed to be the founder of the gay rights movement in the United States, who was a LA communist. That's going to be an interesting digression because, as you know, Huey P. Newton was rather avant-garde, shall we say, in his articulation of the LGBTQ question, as it is today called.
I remember many people, including myself, this was the 72, lost his mind. But he was, I get a lot of criticism, but I think Huey was one of our, he was a great thinker and way ahead of his time. And I think a lot of his, let me put it this way, I think his merits outweigh his demerits. Maybe that's my Louisiana chauvinism coming in. But I know Huey talked about Garvey, Robert Williams, and a lot of his influences. But Huey was into Marxism, studying Mao. He was pretty ahead of his time.
Yeah, I've been intensely involved in this research now. And I think Huey at one point suggested that he would have been satisfied to be a professor of philosophy, because he was really into Marxist philosophy. And as you know, he got a PhD from UC Santa Cruz.
Yes, sir.
And it's going to be I'll be in Santa Cruz doing research by Wednesday, in fact.
Santa Cruz, is that where Angela, was she based there for a while?
Oh, yeah. UC Santa Cruz. I'm looking forward to looking at the papers of John Thorne, who was a lawyer for George Jackson, lawyer for Angela. This is why history needs to always be written and rewritten, because part of his archive is off limits because Angela and Rochelle McGee are still alive. George Jackson's correspondence is not off limits because he passed away. So that means that, say, 10 or 15 years, it'll be time for somebody to look at the correspondence with Angela, Rochelle McGee, and John Thorne.
Well, John Thorne, he did a book on George. I have it. I think it's sitting right on the desk next to me. But Rochelle McGee, I guess we should be reminding people that people are still trying to get him out. Harold Wilton, and there's a committee set up to release Rochelle McGee. Do you have any information? What's the latest information that you've received, Dr. Horne?
Well, we did a segment on that on Freedom Now. I mean, the Governor Newsom, is rather recalcitrant on this point, even though Rochelle McGee has been in prison for decades. And apparently the governor wants to see him die in prison. But I think the committee led by Harold has other thoughts in mind.
I think you've gone over time. I thought you would have kicked us off by now, but really appreciate you coming on. And I would like to thank Lisa Watson for technical brilliance. Melinda Francis, anything else you would like to say?
Well, we'll see everybody in the whirlwind next week.
Take care.